Hello guys, this is Professor Dykstra. I'm going to be your adjunct professor for APHL 104, and this is a little bit of an introduction to Al Wolters' book called Creation Regained. And Al is introducing us to what he would call a reformed worldview, which Trinity Christian College is very much indebted to, and we kind of think a lot from his framework. So we're going to be looking at a lot of Al's work here, and you'll be writing a paper on him. Hopefully you've already written your paper on the questions I've provided you, and then this lecture will kind of help you make some corrections and adjustments and get kind of a bigger picture. Anytime you learn something from this lecture that would switch your paper or adjust your paper, or maybe even need to cross something out of your paper, whatever you learn from this lecture then would be added to your paper, let's say in the color of blue. You can just change the font color to blue, and that way I know that you've watched this lecture and you've incorporated it back into your final draft of your paper. That's part of our learning process. So I'm going to be talking rather fast because you can go back and rewatch this video as many times as you need, or just rewind that section until it makes sense again. So if it seems like I'm going fast, that's because I am. So let's take a look at Al's big structure. Al is looking at two big ideas I think that he's combating in his book, and that is folk Christianity, which I'll explain in a second, and then post-enlightenment categories that separate the sacred from the secular. He's going to fight both of these ideas with great fervor. So let's take a look. Folk Christianity, which he's not going to directly name in the book, but he's fighting all throughout. Folk Christianity is something like this. God created the earth, and if you're really good, you get to go to heaven when you die, and if you're not very good, then you'll go to hell when you die. That's folk Christianity. If you try to take that idea and then bring it in and start reading the Bible, it just doesn't work. The first words of the Bible already will destroy folk Christianity. First words of the Bible from Genesis 1:1 say, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." They're both created, and immediately we notice that most of the story are things coming from heaven down to earth, not how do things from earth go back up to heaven. The entire story is these stories about things from heaven invading earth and redoing it, remaking it, restoring it. So we're going to look at that. The second category that Al's really fighting is what we would call post-enlightenment categories of sacred and secular. These are probably exceedingly familiar to you, but Al hates them, and I kind of do also. I don't think these are healthy in the long run. I think they're going to cause more trouble than they're worth, but I do understand them, but I do reject them. So the sacred ideas would be anything to do with God, like praying, reading the Bible, tithing, any kind of religious activities. And then secular things are just things that we could, do with other people. And let's say we could maybe get together and spend money at a restaurant, whether you're Hindu or Christian or Buddhist, it just wouldn't matter. You can participate in the economy. So those become secular, and anybody can go to a public school, and anybody can paint a picture and do arts. And Al's going to just take this set of distinctions, and he's going to say, this just doesn't work, and here's why. So Al's fighting, again, both folk religion and these post-enlightenment categories. He just doesn't find them useful or helpful. Let's take a look why. Al will say something like this: life is religion, religion is life, meaning God is totally in on his creation story. The creation story is the main story. The creation story is the main story. Not what happens to you when you die, but what's happening in creation. God loves his creation. He says it's good, and he is doing everything he can to restore it. And that means every last thing he loves. He made it. And then finally, again, Al's just going to say there is no sacred secular distinction. God is interested in all things reflecting his glory. He wants all things to reflect his glory. So let's jump in. Al's going to say that he's going to help us develop a reformed Christian worldview. Here's how he defines worldview. It is the comprehensive framework of one's basic beliefs about things. That's a nice sentence, but he breaks it down, and I'll break it down for you, and I'm going to do it quick again. This is all in the book, and it's one of your questions actually in your paper, so I'm not going to do it all for you. But Al's basically saying, look, a worldview has to kind of give you the ability to take a lot of life experiences and interpret them. and to form them. And as you get older, you're going to need those thoughts to be consistent with other thoughts. They're going to need to cohere. It means they're going to have to get well together. And eventually, your thoughts are going to need to also kind of correspond to your day-to-day realities. If, you stick to your guns on some ideal, but it gets you kicked out of your house and it makes you starve to death, maybe it wasn't real. You're going to have to rethink some of those categories. So he's going to try to give you a worldview that's consistent, coherent, and it corresponds to reality. And that's kind of what Al's trying to do here. Part of those ideas now are that they're big basic questions in life. It doesn't matter where we seem to have found historical records, but people seem to be interested in questions like justice. Why do we suffer? Is suffering worth it? Do we survive death? Is there some kind of judgment? What's wrong with the world? What's the solution to it? Very rarely do you find any piece of history that's not dealing with some kind of level of these questions. These are the big basic life questions, the worldview questions. What about beliefs? Al basically wants to say that beliefs kind of are a thought process. They're not so much a feeling, and they need to be defended, whereas feelings don't really need to be defended. They can just be. If I say, oh man, I feel a headache coming on, I don't really need to defend that to you. But if I say I believe God exists and you say, no, he doesn't, now we have a discussion. I'll have to defend that and think about that with you. So those are a little bit different. Beliefs and feelings are slightly different. And he says worldview is mostly about beliefs and not about feelings. And then finally, things are just things that you really care about and think about every day. Whether that would be discussions you have with strangers or your neighbors, not discussions maybe you have with your colleagues at the job where you're highly specialized in a very field of labor, but just discussions you have with people every day. You want to talk about schools and families and governments and relationships. Those are the big things that worldview kind of handles. So a reformed worldview is going to have 4 steps, and you're going to see Al's going to kind of divide his book up into these big steps here. Those are creation, fall, redemption, and then Al's got a whole bunch of different language for the bottom one: restoration, recreation, consummation. But these 4 steps are going to kind of help put a big view over things. Your first paper is only going to deal with the creation and the fall, so we're just going to move through those good. Every time Al gets a chance, he's reminding us that in the Bible especially, creation is always good, full of potential. Meaning, Al will never call creation perfect. I'll say that again. Al will never call creation perfect. Not because it's wrong or bad or evil, but that it hasn't yet been developed. It hasn't yet been developed. So humans are there to start bringing about its good potential out. So I'll give you a quick example. God creates nature, but then what do we do with it? So let's say God puts a tree there. I can cut it down and make that tree into a million different potential good things, right? So in that sense, all of the culture that human makes should now reflect the character of God. And when it does, it seems to build God-honoring culture. And in that way, creation's goodness just keeps getting better and better as humans develop it. So like I said, lots of ways in which this can happen. You can think of a lot of examples. If you get the basic idea that God makes nature and we make culture, you can see a lot of potential goodness in there. Now, into that story comes the fall. And the fall seems to be directly aimed at things with wills. And in the Bible, the things that have wills, the ability to choose, are usually just angels and humans. All right, and Al's going to use some specific language about laws and norms. We'll get into those in the book. Those don't come up to the following week. But for right now, God's basically saying, here's how creation should run. And when things with wills, angels and humans, basically say no, and they say no, and they try to live outside the laws of God, and let's say they try to live outside the norms of God. Let's say you try to develop governments that are not based on justice. Your government's not going to do well very long. It's going to become a tyranny and enslave people instead of setting them free. Same thing with marriages or churches. They have a natural way in which they can develop, and they need to seem to follow some basic human norms. Finally, on the fall, these things with wills, angels and humans, often we find that evil's not so much like a thing, like you can point to it in the room or weigh it on a scale or measure it. It's the lack of something that should be there, and somehow it's just not there. It's just not there. Let me give you a quick example Lies cannot exist without the notion of truth. Lies can feed off of truth, but lies are not things in themselves. They are just the truth twisted out. You can't really commit adultery unless there is such a thing as marriage. You can't really steal something unless there's the concept of ownership. So in this way, evil kind of feeds on the created goodness. It's not a thing in and of itself. It's the twisting or the marring or the absence of something that should be there. This is really a hopeful idea, and the reason why it's hopeful is because it can be removed. Cancer can be taken away from the body, and the body can be restored and put back on its good path. Fighting with a spouse can stop, and you can learn how to be patient and loving and do marriage and be a blessing to your neighbors and all those beautiful things. So in that same way, when you get to the end of Al's book, he believes that creation is filled with potential goodness, and the fall is just trying to ruin that potential goodness. But through the story of Christ, he is bringing it back onto path, not whisking us away to heaven, but restoring all of creation. The heavens and the earth will be restored and put back on its potential good path. And who could ever imagine what it would be like if humans just served faithfully? What could be built? What could be imagined? What kind of cities if we didn't spend most of our time trying to own and beat up each other? Imagine what life could be like. All right, that is our basic introduction to Al Wolters, and I hope that helps get you ready for your paper.